Chapter 1. The Gilded Fall. It was the kind of autumn morning that lent Mayfair an air of crisp grandeur. Outside Langtry's auctioneers on Dover Street, a curious stream of elite society wound its way inside, fur collars brushing against one another, pearls glinting like icicles, and whispers already percolating through the gilded foyer. Today was no ordinary sale. It was the auction of the late Lord Everstone's private collection, a cache of rare objets d'art, naval antiques, and colonial relics accumulated during his controversial lifetime of diplomatic service. But it was one item in particular that drew the gaze of society's most acquisitive patrons, Lot 43, the Ivory Seahorse. According to catalogue notes, the Seahorse was carved in the 17th century by a master craftsman of Goa, fashioned from a single tusk of African ivory, inlaid with chips of blue sapphire, and coiled around a gold anchor. Its provenance was shrouded in mystery, rumoured to have been looted from a Portuguese governor's estate and lost for nearly a century. The newspapers had already dubbed it the Jewel of Colonial Plunder, a nickname that provoked debate in drawing rooms and delighted scandalmongers in equal measure. Inside the oak-panelled auction hall, the rooms swelled with a tension familiar to collectors, half avarice, half anticipation. Lady Adela Marchmont, swathed in a pale green brocade, murmured to her daughter, Celestine, who stood poised and indifferent beside her like a marble statue. Sir Hugo Carrington, known for his antiquities empire, adjusted his monocle with theatrical disdain each time a new guest entered. In the second row, arms crossed and expression unreadable, sat Dr. Basil Rivenhall, once a renowned anthropologist, and now the discredited author of Empire and the Eclipse. 2 seats over, the Italian art dealer Giancarlo Moretti thumbed through his programme with a fox-like smile. And behind them, like a shadow unnoticed until it moved, was a pale man in his 30s with uneven eyes and a torn cuff, Lionel Vale, Lord Everstone's estranged nephew. At precisely 10 o'clock, the auctioneer, a smooth-voiced man named Quentin Havering, rapped his gavel with a certain flourish. The bidding commenced. Silver ewers, lacquered snuff-boxes, opium weights, items passed with polite applause or muttered disinterest. But when Lot 43 was wheeled in on a velvet cushion, a visible hush rippled through the hall. "The Ivory Seahorse, ladies and gentlemen," Havering intoned. "One of only 2 known examples of Indo-Portuguese naval carvings of its kind. Bidding shall begin at £50,000. Bids shot upward almost immediately. Lady Marchmont raised her card with imperial assurance. Giancarlo Moretti countered before she'd even set it down. Sir Hugo snorted and offered 70. At 85,000, Dr. Rivenhall lifted his hand abruptly, his lips tightening. 95, 100, then Lionel Vale stood without, speaking and simply nodded, startling the crowd with his presence and confidence. £110,000, do I hear 115? Before a response could come, the lights flickered. A jolt of murmurs surged through the crowd as the chandelier overhead buzzed and dimmed ominously. The auctioneer glanced toward the back, about to signal for assistance, when a scream rang out, not from the gallery, but from the side corridor leading to the staff offices. The doors burst open. Miss Inez Kramer, personal secretary to Lord Everstone's solicitor, stumbled in, one gloved hand pressed to her mouth. "Mr. Conway, he's dead! He's been stabbed!" Pandemonium. Chairs clattered. The bidding cards dropped like leaves. Inez was helped to a seat by a portly gentleman who identified himself as Major Rathbone and murmured that the deceased, Edgar Conway, was Everstone's estate executor. Several guests rushed toward the side corridor before being herded back by Langtry's junior staff. Quentin Havering's face had gone ashen. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we must suspend the auction. Within 10 minutes, a constable from the Mayfair division arrived, followed closely by Chief Inspector Gerald Bryce of Scotland Yard, a man with greying temples and the flat, squinting look of one who'd long lost patience with the performative elegance of the upper crust. He moved quickly, taking names, issuing orders. Poirot had not yet arrived, but he would. And when he did, it would not be to bid on an ivory relic. It would be to solve a murder tangled in the past, obscured by privilege, and perhaps carved in ivory itself. Chapter 2. Shadows Behind the Velvet Curtain. The side corridor off Langtry's auction hall, usually a realm of quiet clerks and unseen logistics, was now sealed with police cordon tape. A hush had fallen over the grand auction room, broken only by the occasional murmur or the creak of someone shifting in their velvet-upholstered seat. The ivory Seahorse still sat atop its display cushion, now oddly sinister in the stark, flickering light. Chief Inspector Bryce re-entered from the corridor with a grim expression. He conferred briefly with Constable Fraser, then turned toward the assembly, his voice authoritative, and clipped. "No one is to leave. This is now a crime scene. Mr. Edgar Conway, legal executor of the Everstone estate, was found stabbed in the adjoining office. We shall be taking statements immediately." A wave of disquiet passed through the guests, some outraged at the inconvenience, others quietly thrilled to find themselves entangled in a real-life whodunit. Dr. Rivenhall began scribbling notes in the margin of his programme. Lady Marchmont let out a theatrical sigh, her lace handkerchief already poised for display. Lionel Vale remained standing, arms at his sides, eyes trained on the now shuttered hallway. In the far corner of the room, near the grand fireplace beneath the Langtry family, Crest, Inez Kramer sat with her shoulders trembling. Her previously immaculate hat now tilted slightly askew. She clutched a teacup with both hands. Major Rathbone stood guard beside her, arms folded. "Miss Kramer," Bryce called gently, "we'll begin with you, if you feel able." She nodded shakily and rose to her feet, her kitten heels echoing in the now silent room. I went in to fetch Mr. Conway," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "He was due to meet a representative from the British Museum about a disputed colonial artifact. I found him slumped forward at his desk. There was blood, a letter opener in his back." "Did you see anyone leaving?" Bryce asked. The side door was ajar, but I didn't hear a thing. It must have happened just before I entered. I screamed and ran back through the curtain. Inspector Bryce nodded. "Thank you, Miss Kramer. Please remain seated." The constable began collecting names and addresses, and one by one, guests were ushered into a side room for preliminary questioning. Quentin Havering, the auctioneer, looked stricken, though he attempted to maintain his professional composure. "I take it none of the items have been disturbed?" Bryce asked, his eyes sweeping over the auction lot tables. "Not that I'm aware of," Havering said. "Lot 43 was the focus of the sale today. It's insured for over £500,000. Were there any disputes over ownership?" Havering hesitated. There were rumours. Lord Everstone acquired many pieces during his years in the Far East and Africa. The British Museum had expressed concern about several lots. There was even talk of legal action, but nothing formal to my knowledge. Across the room, Celestine Marchmont leaned toward her mother. "I don't see why we must sit here like schoolchildren. That man was some kind of lawyer. What does this have to do with us?" Lady Marchmont gave her daughter a sharp glance. "Because, my dear, when a man is murdered in the midst of an auction attended by half the titled vultures of London, one can assume it was not a mere crime of passion." Celestine rolled her eyes. "Still, it's ghastly. That dreadful little Seahorse is probably cursed." You always did have a talent for melodrama, muttered a voice behind them. It was Sir Hugo Carrington who had now taken the liberty of moving closer. He offered them a sardonic smile, though I admit the timing is dramatic. Bryce's keen eyes missed little. He made a mental note of the trio's subtle barbs, the tension in their postures. He turned next to Lionel Vale, still silent, still apart. "You are Mr. Vale, the deceased's nephew?" "I am," Lionel said. His voice was low but steady. "But I've no idea who would want Conway dead. He was meticulous, painfully so. The estate affairs bored him half to death. Seems someone beat him to it." "You had a strained relationship with your uncle, I understand." Lionel's lip curled slightly. "You could say that. He cut me out of the will. Gave the house to the Royal Historical Society, the silver to a cathedral in Dublin, and this," he gestured broadly, "to the highest bidder." "You were bidding on the Ivory Seahorse," Bryce said. "Yes." "Why?" Lionel hesitated, then shrugged. "Because it was his favourite, the one thing he always refused to sell. I thought, if I owned it, perhaps it would sting him from beyond the grave." A curious answer, and Bryce knew better than to press too soon. By now the statements had begun to form a web, complex, entangled, and dripping with veiled motives, money, legacy, reputation, and beneath them all, the Seahorse, a delicate thing, impossibly rare, and possibly stolen. A constable stepped forward just as Bryce opened his notebook to continue. "Sir," the constable said, "there's a man outside. Insists he was invited to the auction and demands to speak to whoever is in charge." Bryce sighed. "Who is he?" The constable hesitated, then handed over a card. Bryce read the name. His brow lifted. "Show him in at once," he said. Moments later, the doors swung open and in stepped a compact man in an impeccable charcoal grey suit, patent leather shoes gleaming despite the damp streets outside. His moustache was immaculate, his demeanour self-assured, his eyes sharp as cut glass. "I am Hercule Poirot," he said simply, "and I believe there is something here that requires the attention of the little grey cells." Chapter 3. The Unseen Footsteps. Poirot stood at the threshold of the auction hall like an actor arriving a beat before the climax. His tailored overcoat glinted slightly in the light, and he removed his gloves with unhurried precision as Inspector Bryce approached. The chief inspector, not known for deference, nodded cordially. "Monsieur Poirot, I heard you were in town." "But of course," Poirot replied mildly. "I was invited today by Mr. Havering. I had a personal curiosity about Lot 43. The Ivory Seahorse, yes? I understand it is now at the centre of something far more grave." Bryce gave him a tight-lipped smile. "It certainly appears so. A murder. Edgar Conway, solicitor to the Everstone estate, stabbed in his office. Locked room scenario, more or less. The witness claims the side door was open, but no one was seen entering or leaving." Poirot's eyes narrowed, thoughtful. "Ah, but what is seen and what is noticed are not always the same, mon ami." With a gesture, Bryce led Poirot toward the staff corridor. "You're welcome to examine the scene. Frankly, I'd value your eye. This whole affair feels too clean." As they walked, Poirot moved with feline grace, pausing once to cast a glance toward the auction platform. He stopped before the Ivory Seahorse and regarded it with an odd softness. "It is beautiful," he murmured. "Exquisite. And also entirely out of place. You see, it was not made to be displayed. It was made to be hidden. Such craftsmanship exists to impress one person, not the world." Bryce blinked. "You think it's a forgery?" Poirot shrugged lightly. "I think it is a truth disguised as vanity, but let us not leap ahead." The office of the deceased was dimly lit, its desk piled with ledgers, maps and auction schedules. Conway's body had already been removed, but the blood stain on the carpet and the glint of the letter opener on the floor left no doubt as to the nature of his demise. Poirot circled the desk slowly, arms folded. He examined the scuffed baseboard behind the chair. A faint smear, grease or oil, lingered there. He crouched, producing a handkerchief to inspect it more closely. "Not blood," he muttered. "Something mechanical." "An oil stain?" Bryce asked. "Possibly from a shoe, yes, but the smell—" Poirot rose and moved to the window, checking its lock. "Secure, but look, there is dust on the sill, no signs of disturbance." He paused at the door to the corridor. "The curtain? When Miss Kramer entered to find the body, did she come through here or the rear stair?" "Through here," Bryce replied. "She screamed and exited the same way." Poirot nodded and stepped back into the hall. "And this passage connects to the loading bay?" "Yes, staff and delivery entrance, locked during the auction, supposedly." Poirot turned, his gaze resting on a patch of scuffed linoleum. "And yet someone passed through, not in haste, but deliberately." He glanced at Bryce. "Tell me, who would gain the most if this auction were disrupted, if, for instance, the estate fell into a legal dispute? Vale, perhaps? He was cut out of the will, but if the items were frozen in probate— Exactly, or perhaps someone else. Someone who feared what might be revealed through the sale." They returned to the main hall. A few suspects remained, including Lady Marchmont, Celestine, Rivenhall, and Giancarlo Moretti. Poirot's eyes moved between them, his manner calm but penetrating. He approached Lady Marchmont first. "Madame, may I express my deepest regrets for the distressing turn of events?" She inclined her head with frosty grace. "Quite ghastly, Monsieur Poirot, but not entirely surprising. The late Lord Everstone always did attract the wrong sort." "Indeed. But Mr. Conway was hardly one of the wrong sort, no?" She hesitated. "Perhaps not. But the company he kept these last few years— You do know there was a scandal involving one of the acquisitions." "Ah? The Chinese reliquary?" She arched her brow. "So you've heard. The provenance was fabricated, and Mr. Conway defended it all the same." Poirot turned to Celestine. "And you, mademoiselle? Did you know Mr. Conway well?" "Hardly," she said with an elegant shrug. "He always looked at me like I was some bothersome invoice. He once told my mother that I lacked restraint of taste." Poirot allowed himself a faint smile. "He sounds delightfully precise. May I ask, where were you during the moment of the murder?" Celestine glanced at her mother, then back. Sitting beside her. Everyone was watching the bidding. No one moved except— She paused. "Yes, mademoiselle." She frowned. There was a man, standing near the back, beside the curtain. He had reddish hair. He was fidgeting. I remember because he kept shifting side to side like he was trying to see behind it. Poirot and Bryce exchanged a glance. "There's no such man on the guest list," Bryce said quietly. "Could be a plant, a decoy." Poirot tapped a finger to his lips. "Or someone who entered not to bid, but to retrieve." His eyes returned to the ivory Seahorse. "Because sometimes, mon ami, it is not the possession of an object that causes murder, but what it conceals." And with that, he stepped closer to the artifact, lowering his gaze to its base, where a small, almost imperceptible hairline seam curved beneath the anchoring tail. "A cavity," Poirot whispered. "Très intéressant." Chapter 4. The Whispering Provenance. While Poirot's fingers paused just inches from the ivory Seahorse's gilded base, he did not touch it. Not yet. Instead, he examined the minute seam with the same attentiveness a jeweler might grant a hairline flaw in a diamond. His brows furrowed delicately. "Beautiful," he murmured again. "And deceitful, like many things in this room, n'est-ce pas?" Behind him, Quentin Havering, the auctioneer, cleared his throat with visible discomfort. "I must insist, Monsieur Poirot, that no further handling of the artifacts takes place unless sanctioned by the estate's legal custodians. The insurance alone—" Poirot turned slowly, his voice amiable but laced with precision. "Monsieur Havering, a man lies murdered not 20 yards from this room. Your concern for the artifacts is understandable, but surely we must consider whether one of them is not simply an object of beauty, but a container of secrets." Havering paled slightly. If you believe it is relevant, then perhaps I should fetch the keys. There is a felted bottom beneath the Seahorse. It may hide a compartment, though I was told it was solid." "Told by whom?" asked Inspector Bryce, who had rejoined them quietly. "Mr. Conway himself," Havering said. "He insisted the catalogue describe it as solid form. I assumed it was verified, but I've never opened or examined it in detail myself." Poirot said nothing to that, but made a small tisk with his tongue, as if privately disapproving of a man so incurious about his own merchandise. Bryce stepped forward. "For now we leave it untouched. There's no evidence it was tampered with, yet. I'll have it secured in the back room under police supervision until we understand more." As Bryce issued quiet instructions to the constable, Poirot made his way to a modest side table where the auction programs and guest registry lay. He flipped through the sign-in sheet, running a finger delicately down the names. His gaze stopped at a blank line, one just above where he himself had signed. "Curious," he murmured. "A pen stroke that begins but does not finish. Someone hesitated or changed their mind." He tapped the tip of his cane once on the floor. Just then, Dr. Basil Rivenhall approached. "May I, Monsieur Poirot? I feel compelled to say something." Poirot gestured graciously. "But of course, monsieur, one always must speak when one feels compelled. It is when one remains silent that the danger begins." Rivenhall gave a tight smile. "I suspect you've already heard of the tensions surrounding Lord Everstone's collection. I was one of several who publicly criticized his acquisitions, some of them taken, shall we say, under ambiguous circumstances." "Yes," Poirot said. "I am familiar with your writings. Passionate, sharp, unforgiving." "I never accused him of theft," Rivenhall said carefully. "But I did question the ethics of displaying objects stripped from colonized territories. I spoke to Mr. Conway on several occasions. He was always evasive, and now he's dead, and the crown jewel of the auction may contain something more than ivory." Poirot inclined his head. "And yet you chose to bid today?" Rivenhall gave a hollow laugh. "I came to see who else would. Giancarlo Moretti, for instance." At the mention of the name, Poirot's attention sharpened. "Yes, the dealer of Venetian antiquities. I believe he offered a private acquisition of the Seahorse weeks ago." "So I heard," Rivenhall said. "Conway turned him down, said it would attract negative attention." Poirot's eyes moved to where Moretti stood now, arms folded, eyes scanning the room like a predator in a cage. Poirot filed that detail away. He thanked Rivenhall with a polite nod and turned back to the sign-in sheet. Lady Marchmont, seated nearby, leaned toward him with a smile far too warm to be sincere. "Forgive me, Monsieur Poirot," she said, in her polished drawl. "But do you really believe this crime has anything to do with the auction? Conway was a tedious man. I'm sure his murder is some dull, personal matter, jealousy, gambling debts, something from a lower shelf, so to speak." Poirot gave her a long look. "Madame, I believe the motives of murder are not reserved for the low or the desperate. Pride, humiliation, fear, these exist in every drawing-room as surely as they do in back alleys. The only difference is the vocabulary." She blinked at that, unsure whether she'd been insulted. Before she could reply, a hush fell once more across the room. Bryce had returned with an update. "We've completed the initial sweep," he announced. There were no signs of forced entry at the rear corridor. No fingerprints other than, the staff's and Mr. Conway's on the letter opener. But we did find one interesting detail. Everyone listened. In Conway's coat pocket was a torn envelope, no contents, but it had a curious watermark, Bellerive Maritime Consortium. Anyone familiar? Moretti's head jerked slightly at the name. Poirot saw it. So did Bryce. Poirot stepped forward, addressing Bryce but watching the room. Bellerive, that is a private shipping conglomerate, is it not? Operates out of the Seychelles? Indeed, Bryce confirmed. Formerly associated with colonial artifact transfers, until customs regulations shut several of their routes down. Very hush-hush. The silence that followed was thick. Poirot turned slowly to the room, his voice silk-soft but firm. It would seem, mes amis, that Mr. Conway had begun to uncover something. Or perhaps someone had discovered that he had uncovered it first. And somewhere behind those cultured faces, beneath the glittering pearls and velvet gloves, a murderer was watching. Quietly, carefully. Waiting. Chapter 5. A Portrait in Dust and Silence. The room where Edgar Conway had met his end had a quiet, waiting quality about it, walls lined with aged volumes, glass-fronted cabinets of estate documents, and a Persian rug dulled by years of foot traffic. But Poirot noted immediately that for a legal office it bore remarkably little of the usual clutter. No scatter of loose paper, no half-filled teacup, not even an ashtray with the telltale smear of stress-induced smoking. It was too clean. Poirot stood at the doorway and folded his hands behind his back as Inspector Bryce walked slowly through the space again, brows knit. "The body was found here," Bryce said, pointing toward the leather chair behind the mahogany desk. Letter opener lodged between the third and fourth ribs, angled slightly downward. Miss Kramer claimed she found him slumped forward, his head nearly touching the blotter. Poirot's eyes slid over the desk. Immaculate. A single framed photograph, Lord Everstone in his youth, standing beside a Gurkha officer. A pair of cufflinks lay in a velvet tray, and next to the desk lamp, a neatly folded page torn from an auction ledger. "Was this page examined?" Poirot asked. Bryce crouched beside him. "Just a list of item tags and valuations, nothing unusual." "But look," Poirot said gently. "There, see how the left edge is torn at a slight angle? This was not carelessly ripped. It was sheared deliberately, perhaps to conceal what was written on the reverse." Bryce frowned. "Conceal from whom?" Poirot did not answer immediately. He moved behind the desk and crouched again, this time inspecting the floor. He tapped once, then rose and examined the nearby cabinet, a locked drawer just above the skirting board. He reached into his pocket and removed a small handkerchief, folded it over the drawer handle, and pulled. Locked. "Do you have the keys to this?" he asked.
"No," said Bryce, "but we'll get a locksmith if we must." Poirot nodded. "It may prove valuable. But tell me, was anything missing from Mr. Conway's person?" "Just the torn envelope we mentioned. His wallet and watch were untouched." Poirot's eyes twinkled faintly. "Then we may assume robbery was not the motive." Bryce stood, arms crossed. "You think this was tied to a document? Something Conway discovered before the auction?" "Perhaps," Poirot said. "Perhaps it was not what he found, but what he feared others might discover through the sale. If the Ivory Seahorse contained something, anything hidden inside, and Conway knew of it, he could have planned to expose it. Or sell the knowledge to the highest bidder?" Poirot added mildly. There was a pause between them as both men considered this. At that moment, Constable Fraser stepped in. "Sir, Miss Kramer is asking for you. She remembered something?" Poirot and Bryce exchanged a look and followed the constable back into the main hall, where Inez Kramer sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her posture was straighter now, her voice steadier. "It came to me just now," she said. "When I fetched the folder for Mr. Conway earlier, maybe 10 minutes before he was killed, he was arguing with someone. I didn't see who, I was just outside the door." "Did you hear what was said?" Bryce asked. "Only fragments. Mr. Conway said something like, 'You're in no position to threaten me,' and the other man replied something about being exposed unless it's destroyed. I remember those exact words, 'unless it's destroyed.'" Poirot's expression did not change, but a spark of interest lit in his eyes. "You are sure it was a man?" he asked gently. She hesitated. "Yes." His voice was low, sharp. "And I think it was Mr. Moretti." Giancarlo Moretti, who had been standing some distance away pretending not to listen, stiffened visibly. He took 2 steps forward. "This is preposterous," he said. "I spoke with Mr. Conway briefly this morning, yes, but we did not argue. I offered him a final price on the Seahorse. He declined. That is all." Poirot tilted his head. "A final price, monsieur? That implies earlier offers were made?" "They were." Moretti's voice remained controlled, but a hint of irritation crept in. "Several times I wanted the piece for a private buyer." "A buyer who did not wish to bid publicly?" Poirot asked softly. Moretti's jaw twitched. "Not everyone likes to be known in these circles." Bryce folded his arms. "And if this Seahorse contains something smuggled, illegal perhaps?" Moretti's nostrils flared. "I wouldn't know. I only buy what I'm told is valuable." Poirot studied him for a long moment. Then he turned back to Inez. "Mademoiselle, you said Mr. Conway kept a locked drawer. Do you know
what he stored there?" "No," she said. "But I once saw him put something inside, a small parchment scroll, very old. He was agitated when he returned from a meeting with a courier 2 weeks ago. He said, 'The truth follows strange roads.' Then he locked the drawer." "The truth, madame," Poirot said quietly, "always finds its way, even when it has been buried in ivory." As Poirot turned back toward the hall, the gilded Seahorse glimmered faintly under the overhead lights, silent, inscrutable, and perhaps hiding something no one yet dared admit they feared. Chapter 6. The Unquiet Past. By late afternoon, the golden glow in the high windows of Langtry's auction house had dulled to a greyish smear, as if the building itself had absorbed the weight of unease that clung to every corridor. The auction had been suspended indefinitely. Most guests had been sent home, though not before each was questioned and accounted for. Still Poirot remained, lingering like a watchmaker among damaged gears, meticulously observing the spaces between the cogs. Inspector Bryce stood with arms folded near the main desk in the front lobby, poring over a list of items Conway had recently reviewed. Poirot joined him in silence. "No mention of the parchment Miss Kramer described," Bryce muttered. Poirot nodded slowly. "Of course not. The man was discreet, and if, as she says, he was agitated after receiving it, he may have kept its existence secret even from those he trusted." Bryce looked up, skeptical. "So now we have a hidden compartment, a possibly stolen parchment, and a dead solicitor who just happened to refuse a private sale of the Seahorse to a man tied to obscure shipping companies. Convenient." Poirot smiled faintly. "Convenient, yes, but also misleading. Let us not confuse narrative with truth, mon ami. Real crimes, like real people, rarely move in straight lines. He tapped lightly on the counter. Do we have access to Lord Everstone's private inventory notes, not the auction catalogue, but his own records? Bryce tilted his head. We've requested them from the solicitor's firm. They're slow-moving, something about confidential handling. Poirot sighed. Toujours la bureaucratie. The British love secrets almost as much as they love marmalade. As he turned to step away, the heavy oak doors to the entrance creaked open with an icy gust. A tall man in a slate overcoat entered, sharp-featured, with a scar beneath his right ear and the self-conscious gait of someone accustomed to entering rooms where he wasn't welcome. "Lionel Vale," he announced tersely, nodding at Poirot and Bryce in turn. "I was told you wished to see me again." Bryce motioned him over. "Just a few clarifications." Mr. Vale approached, eyes flicking once, almost nervously, toward the glass case where the ivory Seahorse now rested under lock. Poirot noticed the glance and filed it away. "Your relationship with Mr. Conway," Bryce said, "was, by your own admission, distant. Yet you were bidding on the item he refused to sell privately. Explain that." Vale folded his arms. "I didn't care about the item's resale value. It meant something to my uncle, and therefore to me. A symbol, that's all." Poirot raised a brow. "A symbol, monsieur, of what?" Vale's jaw tightened. "Of everything he withheld. I spent years trying to gain his recognition. In the end, he left me nothing, except for the chance to buy back what he loved most." "If that sounds sentimental, well, perhaps I am." Bryce shifted, unconvinced. "And the Bellerive maritime connection? The envelope?" Vale blinked, then frowned. "Never heard of it?" "Strange," Poirot said quietly, "considering your business dealings in Mauritius and Ceylon, where Bellerive once operated." Vale's eyes flickered with a flash of unease. "You've been checking into me?" Poirot only smiled. "It is my way, monsieur." Silence fell. Then, in an unexpected turn, Vale exhaled slowly and said, "Yes, I had dealings with them, years ago. Import, export, rare woods and cultural artifacts. But I severed all ties when it became clear their documentation wasn't precise." "Smuggling," Bryce said bluntly. "I never trafficked anything illegal, but I was surrounded by those who might have." He looked up, steady again. "That's why I walked away." Poirot gave a small nod, as if cataloguing that answer without comment. Then he asked, almost casually, "Did Mr. Conway know of your past dealings?" "I doubt it. He always thought I was an irresponsible embarrassment." Poirot's gaze lingered. "And yet he may have known more than he let on." Before Vale could respond, a commotion erupted near the rear hallway. A junior staff member, a boy no older than 17, rushed in, eyes wide. "Sir, there's been a break-in at the back storage." Bryce and Poirot were already moving. In the dim corridor, one of the side storerooms stood ajar. A display cabinet had been smashed, glass shards glittering on the floor like scattered jewels. But the ivory Seahorse, now placed in a separate iron-reinforced box nearby, was untouched. The shattered case had held only minor colonial trinkets, brass compasses, navigational charts, and a faded oil painting of a schooner. "Diversion," Bryce muttered. Poirot stepped past him and surveyed the scene. A single footprint marked the dust near the cabinet, distinct yet partial. Not the heavy boot of a labourer, something slimmer, Italian leather perhaps. And then Poirot knelt near the baseboard and reached into the narrow gap between cabinet and wall. With careful fingers, he drew out a small scrap of parchment, brittle, curled, and torn. On its surface, barely legible in faded ink, were a handful of words in Portuguese and Arabic script, but one word stood out, scrawled in Old English, smudged at the edges: Seahorse. Poirot stood slowly, lips drawn into a thin line. He handed the scrap to Bryce. "Now we know what someone was looking for," he said softly. "And someone else died to keep it hidden." Bryce looked at him sharply. "But what is it?" Poirot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the shadowy corridor behind them and murmured, "A message. A warning, or a confession, perhaps. But whatever it is, mon ami, it has been hidden for centuries. And someone would kill again to see it buried for good." Chapter 7. A collector of ghosts. That evening, as Langtry's emptied and the remaining investigators took quiet refuge in their offices, Poirot sat alone in the auction house's drawing room, an intimate, rarely used space tucked behind the main hall. The fire was low in the hearth, casting soft orange shadows on the carved panels and dusty oil portraits above. On the table before him sat the fragment of parchment, carefully preserved between two glass sheets and a notepad on which Poirot had begun transcribing the faded script. 3 lines in Arabic, 1 in Portuguese, and that single English word, Seahorse, written in a different hand entirely, and likely added much later. Poirot examined the Arabic with a furrowed brow, whispering under his breath as he read, "The ocean, the gate, the false prophet who hides in the spine of the beast." He tapped a pencil to his lip. "Not literal," he murmured. "A cipher, or perhaps a metaphor tied to something older. An oath, a theft, a betrayal?" There was a soft knock at the door. It was Inez Kramer, her gloved hands wringing the brim of her hat. She stepped inside hesitantly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Monsieur Poirot." "Mais non, Mademoiselle Kramer. Please, do come in. You have remembered something else, I think." She nodded. "Yes, or rather, I have something I kept hidden. Something Mr. Conway entrusted to me." She removed a thin manila envelope from her handbag and placed it carefully on the table. "I didn't give this to Inspector Bryce," she said, almost apologetically. "I wasn't sure whom to trust." Poirot raised a brow. "But you trust me, mademoiselle?" She smiled faintly. "You have a reputation for seeing through people. I thought perhaps you'd see through me too if I tried to keep lying." He inclined his head gently. "Merci. That is both wise and quite brave." He opened the envelope with deliberate care. Inside was a single photograph, yellowed, its edges curled. It depicted 4 men standing aboard the deck of a colonial-era freighter. One of them was unmistakably Lord Everstone in his later years. Another Poirot instantly recognized as a much younger Giancarlo Moretti, less lined, but with the same calculating eyes. The other 2 were strangers, one balding with thick spectacles, the other standing slightly apart, with a prominent ring glinting on his finger, an ivory seahorse mounted in gold. Poirot held the image up to the lamplight. "And this, mademoiselle?" "I don't know the full story," Inez said, "but Mr. Conway once told me that Lord Everstone didn't acquire the Seahorse in a sale. He claimed it, took it from an expedition gone wrong. There was a fight aboard a vessel, something about a cursed relic. 2 men died. The matter was buried." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And the man with the ring?" "No idea. Conway said only that he disappeared. Some claimed he was lost at sea. Others thought he'd faked his death." Poirot's mind raced. The parchment, the seam beneath the ivory, the violent history no one had ever cared to question. "And Mr. Conway," he said softly, "he believed the truth might resurface?" She nodded. "He told me 2 days ago he feared someone had recognized the artifact, that someone was coming to stop the auction from going forward." Poirot exhaled. "And now he is dead." Inez lowered her gaze. He said if anything happened, I was to give that photograph to someone who would understand. Poirot reached out and gently took her hand. You did well, mademoiselle. After she left, Poirot rose slowly and made his way to the secured storage room where the Ivory Seahorse was kept. The constable stationed at the door admitted him without question. He approached the relic as if it were breathing. Up close, it seemed more ominous now than beautiful. The intricately carved eyes, once elegant, now appeared to watch him. The coiled tail wrapped around the golden anchor shimmered with an almost serpentine threat, and that fine seam at the base. Poirot retrieved a pair of gloves from his coat and, with precise care, used a small letter opener to gently prise at the seam. There was a faint click. The base was released. Inside was a small, tightly folded parchment, far older than the scrap found earlier. Poirot unfolded it with reverence. Lines of faded ink sprawled across it in both Arabic and Portuguese, fragments of what appeared to be a confession. At the bottom, a symbol, an inked seahorse entangled with a sword. He blinked once, slowly, then folded the parchment again. As he exited the storage room, he found Bryce waiting just outside. I heard you'd been busy, the inspector said. We traced one of the men from that photo. His name's Dr. Elias Roth, formerly an archaeologist at the British Museum, disappeared in 1931 aboard the ship Mar Azul, listed as lost in a storm. Poirot nodded. And yet I believe he may not have drowned at all. Bryce frowned. You think he's alive? I think, Poirot said carefully, that someone at this auction knew exactly what the Ivory Seahorse truly contained. And I also think that Mr. Conway was not the only one who feared its reappearance. Bryce crossed his arms. So what now? Poirot looked down the long corridor, where shadows gathered near the edges of polished wood and old tapestries. Now, he said quietly, we find the man who once vanished, and who may have returned to erase the past by any means necessary. And as the constable locked the door behind them, the faint scent of sea salt and ancient ink still clung to the air. Chapter 8. The Man from the Mar Azul. By morning, Langtry's auction house was cloaked in a hushed tension. Staff whispered in corners. Rumours crackled beneath the surface like dry leaves underfoot. Though the auction itself had been suspended, the building remained under watch, its shadowed corners now a crucible of secrets, each step echoing with the ghost of Lord Everstone's past. In a modest back office, Poirot sat opposite Inspector Bryce, both poring over the photograph Inez Kramer had surrendered. They had magnified it, comparing facial features to archive records. Elias Roth, the missing archaeologist, stood out not just for his distance in the frame, but for the look in his eyes, wary, calculating, as if already halfway to disappearance. He was last recorded aboard the Mar Azul, Bryce muttered, tapping a faded shipping manifest. Presumed dead in 1931, the vessel sank during a violent squall near the coast of Portuguese East Africa. Only 2 bodies were recovered, neither his. Poirot steepled his fingers. And there was no autopsy, no follow-up investigation? Minimal from what we can find. The ship belonged to a private syndicate linked to, guess who, Bellerive Maritime. Ah, Poirot said, his voice like a quiet chime. The web tightens. He stood, crossed to the window, and gazed into the grey morning beyond. Let us imagine, Inspector, that Dr. Roth did not die. Let us say he disappeared with purpose and means. Why would he return now? Why reveal himself through an act of violence? Bryce was about to reply when the door cracked open. A young officer entered with a folder tucked under his arm. Sir, he said to Bryce, we've been going through the auction attendees' backgrounds again. One name stood out, an Edmund Chase, registered as a maritime consultant from Valencia, but his credentials don't hold. No employment records, no residential footprint in Spain. Bryce sat forward. And? The officer hesitated. We ran a facial recognition scan against passport databases. He's a match, 94% probability, for Elias Roth. The silence that followed was complete. Poirot turned slowly. Alors, the ghost returns. They found Chase, if that was his real name, at a modest boarding house in Paddington, where he had checked in under a false identity 2 days before the auction. The room bore signs of careful planning, multiple sets of gloves, a burner phone, and a briefcase lined with old maritime journals and hand-drawn maps. When confronted, the man did not resist. He stood tall and gaunt, with an air of exhausted dignity, and surrendered himself with a single phrase. It was
never about revenge, it was about remembrance. At Scotland Yard, Poirot asked to speak with him privately. In the interrogation room, Roth, now fully unmasked, sat with the same quiet reserve seen in the old photograph. Poirot placed the folded confession, retrieved from the Seahorse's base, on the table. "I believe this is yours, monsieur." Roth looked down at the parchment and closed his eyes. So it survived. It did, as did you, though I cannot yet fathom the full truth behind your vanishing act. Roth looked up. I didn't vanish. I escaped. After the expedition aboard the Mar Azul, I realized what we had uncovered. The Seahorse, yes, but also its context. It wasn't merely a decorative carving. It was a seal, a marker of a crime buried by time. Poirot waited. There was a village, Roth continued, his voice growing fainter. On the coast of Zanzibar, Lord Everstone and Moretti, along with Bellarive's men, raided it under the pretext of retrieval. They claimed they were recovering stolen colonial relics. In truth, they looted a sacred shrine. The Seahorse was the centerpiece, part of a ceremonial covenant. When the elders resisted, they were silenced, permanently. Poirot's expression did not change. And you could not stop them? I tried. I argued. They threatened to accuse me of treasonous conduct, Roth, the traitor, aiding the native unrest. So I fled. I faked my death with the help of one of the crew and disappeared. I vowed to return only when the Seahorse reappeared. Poirot's voice was soft. Why kill Mr. Conway then? Roth looked genuinely stricken. I didn't. I came here to retrieve the object quietly, before it was sold to yet another collector. But someone got to Conway before I did. When I saw the crime scene, I knew the trail had become dangerous again. Poirot leaned back. So someone else wanted the truth buried. Roth nodded slowly. The Seahorse carries more than ivory. The parchment I hid inside, my confession, was meant for the future. But there's another letter, one Everstone himself penned, a record of what happened. If someone has found it, they might kill again. Poirot rose, calm and composed. Then we must find that final piece. Roth's eyes darkened. You'll need to look within Everstone's personal archive, not the one handled by his solicitors, the private one, hidden in plain sight. Poirot tilted his head. And where would that be, monsieur? Roth gave a bitter smile. In the one place Everstone trusted more than his vaults or his lawyers? His study? At Everstone Hall? Poirot gave a slight bow. Then that is where the final chapter begins. And as he exited the room, Poirot's mind was already calculating the next move, the hidden keys, the unseen threads. For though the Ivory Seahorse sat locked in steel and glass, its secrets were still moving, restless as tides, pulling towards some deeper truth.
Why, Chapter 9. The Shadows of Everstone Hall. The road to Everstone Hall wound like a serpent through rolling Hampshire countryside, the late afternoon sun turning the fields to gold. As the car climbed the gravel path toward the estate, Poirot sat in silence, his gloved hands folded neatly in his lap. Inspector Bryce at the wheel glanced at him from time to time, noting the detective's stillness. "Quite a place," Bryce muttered, as the grand facade of Everstone Hall loomed into view. "Hard to believe the man who lived here built his fortune on bones and artifacts." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Ah, but such grandeur often conceals the darkest sins. The chateau of Versailles was built upon the blood of peasants, non?" Bryce gave a wry grunt, but said no more. Everstone Hall, once a monument to imperial wealth, now stood in fading splendour. Ivy clung to its stone walls, and some of the window shutters hung crookedly. A bitter wind stirred the garden's dead leaves, and the carved griffins atop the main gate watched the visitors with silent disdain. They were met at the door by Mrs. Alcott, the aging housekeeper, whose sharp eyes belied her soft voice. "I was told to expect you," she said, opening the door. "Though I don't know what you hope to find. Lord Everstone's study hasn't been touched since the funeral." Poirot inclined his head. "Then we shall be most careful. It is precisely in places untouched that secrets most often linger." The study was on the second floor, a long rectangular room panelled in dark wood, lined with high shelves crammed with books, ivory carvings, and strange masks from every continent. A large mahogany desk sat near the bay windows, its surface tidy except for an old globe and a framed photo of Everstone with Queen Mary, faded but proudly displayed. Poirot moved slowly, scanning the room as if reading a language only he understood. He trailed a hand along the back of a leather chair, then paused at the fireplace. Above the mantel hung a large oil painting of a sea voyage, a stormy depiction of a galleon, its sails torn, riding waves like jagged glass. "A vanity commission," Bryce muttered. "Had it painted after his last expedition, I believe." Poirot's eyes narrowed. He moved closer to the frame and gently felt behind the canvas. A soft click sounded. "Voila," he whispered. The painting swung forward slightly, revealing a small built-in compartment behind the wall. Inside lay a single, leather-bound ledger, its pages edged in gold. Poirot removed it carefully and set it on the desk. The front bore no title, just a symbol burned into the leather, the Seahorse, entangled with a sword. They opened the book in silence. Inside were pages of scrawled entries, written in Lord Everstone's unmistakable hand. It began innocuously, records of acquisitions, sales, coded references to foreign agents, and unnamed intermediaries. But deeper in, the tone changed. Poirot's finger stilled on a page dated March 1931. Roth threatened to break ranks, foolish idealism. He called it desecration, laughable. He does not see what this relic represents. The Seahorse binds the fable to the treasure. Without it, the map is worthless. The others are expendable. Poirot turned the page slowly. More entries followed, paranoia blooming, names crossed out in haste. Then, near the end, "If it is ever revealed, if the parchment is discovered, I must ensure the ledger is destroyed. The parchment must never be linked with this book. Hide them apart, one for the object, one for the story." Bryce drew in a sharp breath. He was documenting everything, down to the double-crossing and cover-ups. Poirot closed the book with a soft thump. "It is not only history, it is a confession. Roth was right, but so too was Conway. He tried to make it known. Perhaps he found this ledger and realized what the Seahorse truly was, a legacy of theft, and someone killed him to keep it buried." Bryce stepped back from the desk, his expression grim. "But who? Everstone's dead, Roth is in custody, and Moretti, he's disappeared again. Poirot's gaze drifted to the window where the garden paths twisted like forgotten memories. Not Moretti, he said softly. He's too careful to act in rage, but someone close to this estate, someone who had access to both the ledger and to Conway. He turned sharply. Mrs. Alcott. The housekeeper, who had been waiting just beyond the door, startled. Monsieur? Would you be so kind, Poirot said gently, as to bring us a list of visitors to the hall in the last 2 months? Anyone who came by appointment or by invitation, and, if you recall, did Mr. Conway ever visit? She hesitated, then nodded. He came once, about 3 weeks ago, said he was conducting a provenance check on the Seahorse, asked to see the study. I let him in, of course. Lord Everstone's heir gave standing permission. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The heir, Mr. James Everstone. His great-nephew. Bryce blinked. He's the one trying to revive the Everstone Foundation, isn't he? Young fellow, bit of a public darling. Mrs. Alcott gave a hesitant nod. He seemed polite, but cold, businesslike. Poirot said nothing, but in his mind the pieces were beginning to align. Conway had discovered the ledger. James Everstone, eager to protect the family legacy and its wealth, could not allow that revelation to derail the auction. A confrontation ensued, and then murder. Poirot turned to Bryce. We must speak with Mr. Everstone at once, before the shadow his great-uncle cast becomes his own. Outside, the sun dipped below the hills, casting Everstone Hall into long, reaching shadows. And somewhere, beneath stone and secrets, a truth waited still to be named. Chapter 10. The Heir Apparent. The grand drawing-room of Everstone Hall bore all the hallmarks of inherited privilege, silken drapes, bronze busts, and oil portraits of solemn ancestors, each more austere than the last. Into this relic of empire stepped James Everstone, tall, tailored, and undeniably composed. He entered with the careful grace of someone accustomed to scrutiny. Poirot and Inspector Bryce rose as he approached. Mr. Everstone, Bryce said, thank you for agreeing to speak with us on such short notice. I understand it's about the auction, James replied, offering a cordial smile. And the incident. I was in town meeting with a trustee of the Everstone Foundation. Your message reached me there. Indeed, Poirot said, studying the young man carefully. The tragedy at Longtrees has shaken many, but it is the past that may prove more dangerous still. James raised a brow. I beg your pardon? Poirot motioned toward the settee. Please, sit. We are not here to accuse, only to understand. James hesitated, then lowered himself with effortless poise. I'm happy to assist, but I've already told the Yard what little I know. Mr. Conway and I met only once, briefly. Bryce interjected. Yet Mrs. Alcott confirmed that Mr. Conway visited the hall 3 weeks ago. He requested access to Lord Everstone's private study. That would require your express permission. A flicker, subtle, passed across James's face. Yes, that's true. He said he was investigating certain pieces ahead of the auction. I wanted to verify the documentation. He was rather insistent. Poirot leaned forward. And what was your impression of him? Driven, perhaps too much so. He had this moral fervour about him, spoke of historical theft, cultural plunder. He seemed determined to tarnish my great-uncle's name. I understood then he wasn't simply a solicitor. He was an activist. Poirot nodded slowly. And did he find anything that troubled you? James's tone was carefully measured. He didn't tell me directly, but I assumed he was looking for controversy. You know how it is, anything to stir scandal and headlines. I let him view the study, though in hindsight. Perhaps I should have been more cautious. Bryce crossed his arms. Did you know about the hidden compartment behind the fireplace painting? Now James's mask cracked slightly. That was unexpected news. I've never tampered with the study's furnishings. Poirot gave a small, sympathetic nod. Of course, and yet there is something else, something most troubling. This ledger, monsieur, speaks of a parchment, a companion to the Ivory Seahorse. A map, perhaps? A legend? Something Lord Everstone sought to keep separate? James's face remained impassive, but he lowered his eyes a moment too long. I've heard family whispers about the Seahorse secret, but nothing concrete. My great-uncle was a collector, yes, but also a man of theatrical flair. It's possible he invented a mystery where none existed. Poirot stood and slowly circled the room, his polished shoes soft on the rug. And yet the ledger is real, the relic is real, Mr. Conway is dead, and I must ask myself, monsieur, who gains the most from silence? There was a long pause. James straightened, his voice firm now. Let's be honest, Monsieur Poirot. You believe I killed Conway to protect my inheritance, that I silenced him to keep the legend intact. Poirot did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and gazed out at the dusky garden. Then he turned. No, monsieur, I do not believe I examine. And what I see is this. Conway knew something. He confronted someone. He died. The Ivory Seahorse was nearly sold with a story attached, one that might have destabilized its legacy and, by extension, the Everstone name. James stood as well now. Are you suggesting the relic should be hidden away, forgotten? Poirot smiled faintly. I suggest only that truth is rarely profitable, but always necessary. A knock came at the door. Mrs. Alcott entered quietly, bearing a small box. Forgive me, but I've found something. This was in Mr. James's luggage. It was left open in the guest room. I thought, perhaps you should see it. James's face turned sharply. That's private. But Mrs. Alcott had already placed the box on the low table. Bryce stepped forward and lifted the lid. Inside was a folded parchment, aged, frayed at the edges, a seahorse stamped in red wax. The room fell utterly silent. James exhaled slowly. That was given to me by my great-uncle shortly before he died. He said it was a curiosity. He never explained it. Poirot tilted his head. And yet, you never presented it to the solicitors, or the auctioneers, or the historians Mr. Conway represented. Why, monsieur? James's voice dropped. Because I didn't know what it meant, and I wasn't about to trigger a media frenzy over a family myth. I wanted time to understand it before the world took it apart. Bryce's eyes narrowed. But Conway found out, didn't he? James's hands clenched. Yes. He confronted me 2 days before the auction, said I had a duty, threatened to stop the sale if I didn't come forward. We argued, loudly, but I didn't kill him. Poirot stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. Then who did? James swallowed hard. I don't know, but I believe someone else did have access to the truth. Someone who's been far too quiet. Who? Bryce asked. James's eyes shifted. Celestine Marchmont. She was close to Conway, too close. Poirot did not react visibly, but his mind was already at work. A new thread had appeared. Not James alone, not greed alone, but perhaps something older, subtler. And in the tangled depths of the Seahorse's legend, a woman waited. Watching. Waiting. Chapter 11. Whispers beneath the velvet. The Marchmont residence stood just off Grosvenor Square, a townhouse of white stone and ivy-clad columns, discreet yet opulent. Hercule Poirot arrived at 4:30, impeccably dressed as ever, with his gloves tucked beneath his arm and his gaze sharpened by suspicion. Inspector Bryce followed close behind, his manner less elegant, more direct. They were admitted by a butler who barely concealed his discomfort, and led them through a series of hushed drawing rooms until they reached Lady Adela Marchmont, reclining in a damask chair like a duchess from a forgotten age. Across from her, Celestine sat by the window, chin high, expression unreadable. Poirot inclined his head. "Lady Marchmont, mademoiselle, forgive the intrusion." Adela fluttered her hand. "Oh, we're quite used to interruptions these days, Monsieur Poirot. It's the fashionable thing now, isn't it? Murder at an auction? How utterly ghastly." Celestine turned to look at Poirot directly. "You're here about Edgar Conway?" Bryce gave a tight nod. "You knew him?" "I did," Celestine said, calm but cool. "Not intimately. He attended a symposium at the Royal Historical Society last year. We spoke about decolonization, restitution of art, that sort of thing." Poirot moved toward the hearth. "And yet he confided in you." Her eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "He told you about his suspicions, about the Everstone collection, perhaps even about the parchment." A flicker of something passed across her face, but she didn't look away. "He believed the Seahorse was a map," she said at last, "a cipher leading to something hidden. Not treasure exactly, but records, letters, transactions, proof, he said, of how certain artifacts came into Lord Everstone's possession." Lady Adela sat up straighter. "That's quite enough, Celestine. You know your father would never—" Poirot held up a hand. "Forgive me, milady, but the truth must not tremble in the presence of pedigree." Celestine stood, moving to the mantel where a small brass clock ticked with anxious rhythm. "Edgar told me he believed the Ivory Seahorse was carved with coordinates embedded in its design. The sapphire inlays weren't decorative. He said they corresponded to constellations, nautical positioning. He was obsessed." Bryce scribbled in his notebook. "And did he confront anyone with this theory?" Celestine hesitated. "He said he planned to stop the auction. He suspected the Everstone family intended to bury the relic's true significance, that it wasn't art, it was evidence." Poirot's voice was almost a whisper. "Did he say who might stop him?" Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Poirot stepped closer. "Mademoiselle, this is not merely about a seahorse, nor even about Lord Everstone's legacy. A man is dead, and if you possess knowledge withheld from the police—" "I tried to warn him," Celestine burst out. "2 nights before the auction. I told him he was in danger, that there were others at the gala who had too much to lose. He dismissed me." "Who?" Bryce demanded. She paused. "Giancarlo Moretti," Lady Adela gasped. "Celestine, really?" "He approached Edgar during a dinner at Draycott House last week," Celestine continued, her voice firm now. "I overheard them arguing in the corridor. Edgar said, 'You're not a collector, you're a thief, with a veneer of respectability.' Moretti replied, 'If you think you'll expose the chain of ownership, you'll find that chain wrapped around your throat.'" Poirot turned toward Bryce, who was already flipping back through his notes. "We knew they had words," Bryce muttered. "But that's far more pointed than anything we'd confirmed." Poirot folded his arms. "And yet Signor Moretti has said nothing of this conversation." Celestine looked down, her voice quieter now. "I didn't want to be dragged into it, but Edgar was different. He wasn't just chasing scandal. He truly believed restitution was possible, that we could correct the past." Poirot offered a nod of gentle admiration. "And that, mademoiselle, makes him both brave and vulnerable." Bryce turned to Lady Marchmont. "Did either of you see Mr. Conway after the incident at Draycott?" Celestine answered. "He came to my flat the evening before the auction. He said he had proof. Papers, something he found hidden in the Seahorse's case, but he didn't show me. Said it was safer if I didn't see it." Poirot's brows lifted. "Safer? For you or for him?" Celestine didn't answer. The room had grown cold. Poirot moved to the window, gazing out as dusk painted London's skyline in purples and steel. "It is always the case, n'est-ce pas?" he murmured. "When one looks too deeply into the ocean, one finds not only the relics of the Empire, but the anchors that dragged men down." Lady Adele arose, visibly rattled. "I do hope, Monsieur Poirot, that you don't intend to humiliate my family with insinuations." He turned, serene but unyielding. "I intend only to unearth the truth, madame, and if it lies buried beneath marble and inheritance, so be it." As they took their leave, Celestine followed them into the corridor. "Moretti's flying to Lisbon tomorrow," she whispered. "I heard him boast about it at the gala. He said the real treasure was never on display." Poirot's eyes gleamed, and in that moment a shift occurred, subtle as the tide, certain as the stars. They were no longer hunting a killer alone. They were chasing a relic that refused to stay buried, and someone, perhaps Moretti, was already halfway to hiding it again. Chapter 12. The Map Within. The morning dawned grey and damp as London bristled beneath a soft drizzle, the kind of rain that clung to windows and thoughts alike. In a quiet alcove at the British Museum's manuscript reading room, Hercule Poirot sat poised over a glass-covered display of navigational charts and maritime codices from the 17th century. He studied the lines with a frown of intense focus, his fingertips pressed lightly together just beneath his chin. Inspector Bryce arrived, a faint sheen of rain on his coat, and joined him without preamble. "So," Bryce said in a low voice, "you think the Seahorse is more than ornamental?" Poirot nodded slowly. Celestine said Edgar believed the sapphire inlays were coordinates, constellations specifically. But the position of stars alone is not sufficient. One must consider context, period, cartographic style, astronomy, yes, but also the politics of placement. Bryce glanced around uneasily. "You make it sound like the thing's a bloody treasure map." "A treasure of knowledge, perhaps," Poirot said, "but one that someone is desperate to keep hidden." From his coat pocket, he drew a small sheaf of photographs, enlarged images of the Ivory Seahorse taken before the auction. Bryce leaned over them. Poirot pointed to 3 inlays on the Seahorse's back. "These are not merely decorative sapphires. They correspond to the constellation Pegasus, but not as it appears today. It is positioned as mapped by Dutch explorers during the late 1600s. And this?" He indicated a curling ivory motif near the Seahorse's base. "It resembles the seal used by the Dutch East India Company." Bryce gave a low whistle. "You think it marks a location?" Poirot tapped the image again. "No, mon ami, I think it marks a voyage, a route taken, a ledger kept. If Conway found anything, it would be a paper trail tied to colonial expeditions. Letters, contracts, perhaps even proof of acquisition through illicit means." "Which Moretti would want destroyed," Bryce murmured. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And yet, he did not simply steal the Seahorse. He waited until it passed through official hands, until it was auctioned." Bryce frowned. "That doesn't make sense. If it's evidence, he'd want to keep it out of circulation entirely." "Unless," Poirot said, "what he truly sought was already removed from it. Edgar mentioned he had found something concealed inside the Seahorse's case, perhaps the parchment Celestine spoke of." A light flickered in Bryce's eyes. "And that parchment, if we could find it, would expose the entire operation. Poirot stood, gathering the photographs and sliding them back into his pocket. "Moretti leaves for Lisbon this evening," Bryce said. "We can intercept him at the terminal, but if he doesn't have the parchment—" "Then we must look elsewhere," Poirot said. "We must consider where Conway might have hidden it." They exited the museum and made their way through the fog to Bloomsbury, where Edgar Conway's modest flat still stood, sealed by police tape. Bryce flashed his credentials to the constable on duty, and they were allowed in. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and books. Poirot moved slowly, absorbing the rooms, details, stacks of journals, annotated maps, a globe marked in red thread. On the desk sat a teacup, long, cold, beside an open notebook. Poirot approached it with reverence, flipping through pages filled with scribbles in an anxious hand, coordinates, symbols, Latin phrases. "Here," Poirot said, "look at this. Equus marinus, custos tabularum." He looked up. "The Seahorse, keeper of the records." Bryce frowned. Could be a metaphor, or a clue. Poirot looked around the flat, then walked to the bookshelf beside the hearth. He would have hidden it where no one would suspect, somewhere within his scholarly world. He ran his fingers along the titles until he stopped at a thick volume bound in green leather. Artefactum et Auctoritas, Dutch Maritime Holdings, 1610–1705. With a gentle tug, he removed the book. Something shifted inside. Poirot opened it, and out fell a folded sheet of aged vellum. Bryce caught it before it hit the floor. Unfolding it slowly, they both inhaled. The parchment bore a map, not of territory, but of transactions, annotations in a cramped, archaic Dutch hand, beside names recognizable even now: Everstone, Van Wittel, Marchmont. A line of text ran beneath: "Opgenomen 10 koste van bloed en stilte," acquired at the cost of blood and silence. Bryce's voice was quiet. "It's a manifest, a ledger, and damning," Poirot said gravely. "This is what Conway died for. This is what Moretti fears." Poirot stepped to the window and looked out toward the grey skyline, his mind already racing ahead. "It is not enough to catch the man. We must decide. Do we expose this? Do we let the past rise and judge the present?" Bryce said nothing for a long moment. Then, "We bring it in. Let the Crown decide." Poirot turned, his face unreadable. "Then let us act swiftly. Tonight, before Moretti boards his plane, we confront him, with truth as our weapon." Outside, the rain had begun to fall in earnest, but inside the flat, beneath the weight of centuries, a reckoning had begun. Chapter 13. The Terminal Truth. The rain had turned into a steady drumbeat as dusk descended over London. Heathrow's Terminal 4 gleamed under the metallic hue of floodlights, travellers hurrying in all directions beneath umbrellas and hoods, dragging suitcases through wet pavements slick with runoff. Inside the departures hall, Poirot and Inspector Bryce stood near the information kiosk, their coats damp and eyes sharp. Bryce glanced at his pocket watch. "Gate 17, Tap Air, Portugal, boarding in 25 minutes. Poirot nodded. "It will be tight. But precision, mon ami, is everything." Beside them, an airport officer named Sutton, whom Bryce had called ahead, waited with a plainclothes officer near the security checkpoint. They were under orders not to arrest Moretti unless instructed, but to observe carefully. Poirot held the parchment in a waterproof folio beneath his arm, secured and hidden. Then, like a shadow emerging from fog, Giancarlo Moretti stepped through the entrance doors, an umbrella folded neatly at his side, a leather attaché under one arm. He wore a double-breasted trench coat and a pale blue scarf looped neatly at the collar. His expression, poised as ever, gave away nothing. Bryce stiffened. "There he is." Moretti moved past the ticket counters and made it directly for security. Poirot stepped forward and intercepted him, lifting one gloved hand in greeting. "Signor Moretti, a moment, if you please." Moretti slowed, momentarily surprised, then smiled. "Monsieur Poirot, I confess I did not expect to see you here. And at such an hour." Poirot gestured with mild apology. "Forgive the drama, but the matter is pressing." "I was just about to board. Can this not wait?" Poirot's eyes did not leave his. "You are not merely returning to Lisbon. You are fleeing, signor. And you do so with the belief that no one will follow." The smile on Moretti's face twitched slightly, then reasserted itself. "If this is about lot 43, I remind you I placed a legitimate bid. I left empty-handed." "But you did not leave empty-motivated," Poirot replied. "And now it seems you leave empty-hearted as well." Bryce stepped in. "We need to ask you some questions, off the floor." Moretti's fingers tightened briefly on his umbrella handle. "Am I being detained?" "You're not under arrest," Bryce said, "but you may want to hear what we've uncovered." Moretti's gaze darted briefly toward the glass partition behind them, toward Gate 17. Then he sighed and gestured with two fingers. 5 minutes, no more." They moved into a quiet lounge near the corner of the terminal, now largely deserted. The rain created a shimmer of moving shadows across the windows. Poirot waited until they were seated before he unfastened the folio and laid the folded vellum gently on the table. Moretti's expression shifted almost imperceptibly at the sight. "You recognize it, I see," Poirot said. Moretti remained silent. "This," Poirot continued, "is the document Edgar Conway discovered. The parchment once hidden within the base of the Ivory Seahorse, a ledger of trade, yes, but also of acquisition, manipulation, and theft. A relic of a secret pact forged by men whose names still carry power." He tapped the paper with one finger. "It mentions Lord Everstone. It mentions Van Whittle, your predecessor in the Lisbon Exchange, and yes, it even names Marchmont Holdings." Moretti leaned back slightly. "You assume too much from a few scribbled names and colonial ink." "It is more than an assumption," said Poirot. "It is history and murder." Bryce added, "Edgar Conway died because of this document. You or someone acting on your behalf stabbed him in the offices behind the auction hall. You knew he'd found something. He told Miss Kramer he was afraid. You removed the Seahorse from the hall after the chaos, but it was already too late. The parchment was gone." Moretti remained motionless, though a vein in his neck had begun to pulse faintly. Poirot lowered his voice. "Why did you not take it sooner? Why allow the auction at all?" Moretti's voice, when it came, was quiet. "Because the eyes of the world were on it. Had I interfered, I would have exposed myself. My interest was, meant to be anonymous." "And yet," Poirot said, "you grew nervous. Perhaps because Edgar spoke to someone, perhaps even to the Marchmonts themselves." Moretti's jaw clenched. "That document cannot be made public. It would cause instability in several governments, expose treaties long buried, and create a frenzy of lawsuits from descendants, companies, even nations. The damage would be incalculable." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And that justifies murder?" Moretti stood slowly exhaling. "But I did not kill him." There was a beat of silence. Bryce stood as well. "You'll still need to come with us, until we know who did." Moretti's shoulders tensed, but he did not resist. Sutton and the plainclothes officer stepped forward. One retrieved Moretti's attaché, the other walked him out quietly through a side exit. When they were gone, Bryce turned to Poirot. "You believe him?" Poirot said nothing for a moment. Then, "He did not lie when he said exposure would ruin powerful people, but I believe he did not kill Conway. He is a man of shadows, not violence." Bryce folded his arms. "And we're back to the Marchmonts." Poirot nodded. "And to Lionel Vale, who vanished after the auction. We must return to Dover Street. There is more still buried, beneath the surface, and perhaps beneath the ivory itself." As the rain continued to fall beyond the glass, Poirot's reflection merged with the moving streams, unwavering yet shifting, much like the truth he now pursued. Chapter 14. The secrets beneath the Marchmont Gallery was silent under the leaden dawn, its windows glinting faintly beneath a soot-grey sky. Poirot, impeccable in his pressed suit and polished shoes, arrived precisely at 7:30, accompanied by Inspector Bryce and a grim-faced constable. A key, provided reluctantly by Harriet Marchmont the night before, turned in the gallery's main door. It opened with a metallic sigh as though resentful of the intrusion. Inside, the space was shrouded in an eerie stillness. The ivory Seahorse had been removed, catalogued and sequestered under police protection. But Poirot's interest no longer lay in the artifact itself. He moved purposefully past the display cabinets into the narrow back corridor where Edgar Conway had been found. The room had been cleared, yet Poirot's gaze swept over every inch, every crease in the wallpaper, every scuff on the skirting boards. "This is where he died," Bryce murmured. "Stabbed once, clean wound, no sign."
Of a struggle. The killer knew what they were doing. "Indeed," Poirot agreed. "But it is not only what they did, but what they did not do that speaks volumes." He turned, moving to the baseboards lining the far wall. With gloved fingers, he tapped along the wooden edge. A hollow thud answered back. He paused, knelt, and produced a small penknife from his coat pocket. Bryce watched in silence as Poirot pried loose a narrow panel. Behind it lay a dust-lined cavity, and within a small velvet pouch. Bryce stepped forward. "Good Lord." Poirot opened the pouch delicately. Inside lay a second, smaller scroll, aged but preserved, the ink faded yet legible. It was not a ledger this time, but a letter. Initial L.V. Lionel Vale, Poirot whispered. "This is a confession." Bryce read over his shoulder. "I fear what we have done will not stay buried. The artifact is but a decoy. The parchment is what they truly want. I agreed to the auction under pressure, but now I regret it deeply. Marchmont knows, Harriet perhaps, but not Oliver. Edgar suspects. I pray I am wrong. But if this should be found, know that I tried to undo what was done." Bryce exhaled. So Vale knew the parchment's true significance, and he feared Marchmont? "Not Harriet," Poirot said softly, "but Oliver, or someone aligned with him." They returned to the main hall just as footsteps echoed beyond the threshold. Harriet Marchmont entered, pale and composed in a steel-grey coat. Her eyes flicked between them. "I thought you might come." "You gave us the key, madame," Poirot said gently. "You must have known what we would find." Harriet's hands, folded at her waist, trembled faintly. "I didn't know about the letter, but yes. I suspected something had been hidden." Bryce stepped forward. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because—" She hesitated. "Because it was my brother who convinced Lionel to go through with the auction. He was insistent. He knew about the parchment. He must have. Lionel trusted him. And then Edgar was found dead, and Lionel disappeared. I didn't want to believe Oliver could be part of something so vile." Poirot studied her face. "But you believe it now?" "I don't know what to believe." Her voice cracked. "Only that I am done protecting ghosts." Poirot nodded gravely. Then tell us, where would Oliver go if he feared discovery? Harriet hesitated. He has a cottage in Sussex, near Rye. It belonged to our mother. He goes there when he's overwhelmed. Address: Farthing Hollow Lane, number 11. Bryce was already on the phone, barking orders to dispatch officers to the location. Poirot turned back to Harriet. There is still time, he said quietly. For justice, for peace. She looked away, eyes glistening. Then find him, before this destroys us all. As she departed, Poirot lingered by the now empty pedestal, where the Seahorse
once stood. He touched its smooth surface, then turned to Bryce. We are close now. The Ivory was never the treasure. It was always a vessel, a decoy, as Lionel said. But the true prize, the parchment, revealed truths that men would kill to keep hidden. Bryce holstered his notebook. We'll bring him in, if he's there. Poirot's gaze darkened. He will be. But whether he is ready to confess, that is another matter. They exited the gallery into the drizzle, the morning light, thin and bleak. Somewhere in Sussex a man waited in exile, haunted by secrets he could no longer bury. And Hercule Poirot, with the fire of truth burning in his chest, followed the trail, not just to a suspect, but to a reckoning years in the making. Chapter 15. The Man in the Cottage. Farthing Hollow Lane wound through the Sussex countryside like an old memory, half forgotten and mist-veiled. The fields stretched on in solemn stillness, broken only by wind-stirred hedgerows and the occasional bleat of a distant ewe. Poirot sat beside Inspector Bryce in the back of the police motor, his gloved hands clasped tightly over his cane as they approached number 11. It was a modest stone cottage, ivy creeping up its sides, the roof sagging slightly from years of neglect. A faint column of smoke rose from the chimney, proof that someone was within. As the constable pulled the vehicle to a stop at the gate, Bryce motioned to two officers flanking the path. "Quietly," he instructed. "No sudden moves. We don't know what state he's in." Poirot, ever fastidious, adjusted his cuffs and stepped lightly onto the gravel path. He surveyed the scene, no signs of recent activity outside, save for a muddy pair of boots on the porch and a stack of yellowing newspapers untouched. A robin flitted from the hedge as Bryce approached the door and rapped firmly. A pause, then footsteps, slow and hesitant. The door creaked open. Oliver Marchmont stood on the threshold, unshaven, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. His once proud posture had wilted beneath the weight of sleeplessness and fear. He wore a faded dressing gown over trousers, a chipped teacup in his hand. He blinked at them as if from a fevered dream. "I was expecting this," he murmured. Poirot stepped forward, eyes never leaving the man's. "Monsieur Marchmont, it is time we spoke, truthfully." Oliver hesitated, then turned wordlessly and retreated inside. The officers moved to follow, but Poirot held up a hand. "No need. He will not flee. He's too tired to run." Inside, the cottage was a strange blend of the scholarly and the neglected. Books lined the walls, many with yellowing pages. Ancient maps lay unrolled on the table beside a plate of cold toast. In the corner sat an open trunk, half filled with documents, journals, and what appeared to be a crumpled grey raincoat. Bryce surveyed the room while Poirot seated himself opposite Marchmont, who had slumped into a sagging armchair by the hearth. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Poirot broke the silence. "You were present the night Edgar Conway died." Oliver's mouth twitched. He didn't deny it. "You had reason to silence him," Poirot continued. "He had found the letter, Vale's confession. You feared he would bring it to light." Oliver shook his head. "I didn't kill him." Poirot leaned forward. "But you knew who did." Marchmont closed his eyes. "I should have stopped it," I should never have let it begin. Bryce stepped forward. What exactly did you let begin, Mr. Marchmont? Oliver opened his eyes, red-rimmed with fatigue. It started years ago, before the gallery, before Lionel's final acquisition. We, Lionel, Edgar, and I, were approached by a private buyer. Wealthy, anonymous. He wanted the Ivory Seahorse and everything that came with it. That included the parchment. Lionel resisted. He believed the artifact belonged in a museum, but there were debts, silent, dangerous debts. One Harriet didn't even know about it. Poirot tilted his head. And so you pressured him? I didn't think it would end like this. Oliver's voice cracked. When Lionel disappeared, when Edgar started sniffing around, asking questions, I panicked. I told someone who had more to lose than I did. Bryce's voice was sharp. Who? Oliver hesitated, eyes flicking toward the trunk. Poirot rose, walked to it, and lifted a stack of papers. Beneath them lay a business card, plain, unassuming. It bore only a name, Julius Gant. Poirot's brow furrowed. The financier. He attended the auction. Oliver nodded. He bankrolled the gallery's expansion. In exchange, he demanded discretion and access to the Seahorse. I think he believed the parchment would prove something, some lineage or inheritance claim. When Lionel went missing, Gant insisted the auction continue. He said he'd make it all go away if I stayed quiet. And Edgar? Bryce asked. He wouldn't be bought. Oliver's hands trembled. I told Gant that Edgar had found something. The next day, he was dead. Poirot stood silently for a moment, processing the confession. Then he turned to Bryce. We must speak with Monsieur Gant immediately. Bryce nodded. We'll issue a warrant. Oliver's voice stopped them at the door. I never meant for anyone to die. I only wanted the gallery to survive. Harriet, she built it with so much pride. I thought if I could protect it, maybe I could save something. Poirot's gaze softened. Monsieur Marchmont, one cannot save what is built on deceit, but perhaps you have begun to repair what matters most with truth. Outside, the wind had picked up, tugging at the hedges and scattering petals from the overgrown garden. Poirot paused at the gate, eyes narrowed. The case, once tangled in whispers and shadows, now revealed its darker heart, not greed alone, but desperation. A financier's ambition. A brother's guilt, a collector's silence. And still, the final confrontation loomed. Julius Gant had orchestrated from behind the curtain. But Hercule Poirot would soon draw him into the light. Chapter 16. Gant's Game. The Gant estate rose from the edge of the downs like a fortress grown from money. Modern in architecture, yet cold and precise, glass walls, symmetrical hedges, and a driveway designed less for hospitality than for surveillance. A security gate hissed open as the police motor crunched up the gravel drive, flanked by two plainclothes officers in an unmarked car just behind. Julius Gant was waiting for them on the front steps, tailored in charcoal wool, his greying hair slicked back, and a smile on his lips that did not quite reach his eyes. "Inspector Bryce," he said, stepping forward. "And Monsieur Poirot, if I'm not mistaken. I've heard of your reputation." Poirot merely inclined his head. "It is unfortunate, monsieur, that your acquaintance with me comes under such circumstances." Bryce wasted no time. "Mr. Gant, we're here in connection with the deaths of Lionel Vale and Edgar Conway. We would like to ask you a few questions." "Of course," Gant replied smoothly. "Although I'm afraid I have little to offer. I hardly knew either man beyond our professional ties." "Then you will not object to us conducting a search of your home?" Bryce said, producing a folded warrant. Gant's smile remained, but there was the faintest narrowing of his eyes. Naturally not. You'll find nothing here except meticulous records and a great many works of art. Inside, the house was austere, everything in pale shades of cream and grey. No clutter, no warmth. A steel sculpture of two entwined stags dominated the entryway. As Gant led them into his study, Poirot's eyes passed over an array of curios set neatly along a backlit shelf. African masks, antique coins, a Sumerian figurine in glazed terracotta. "Your tastes are eclectic," Poirot noted. "I invest in rarity," Gant said with a shrug. "Whether it's oil, land, or forgotten artifacts." Bryce gestured to one of the officers who began photographing the room, while another moved down the hall. "We're interested in a specific rarity," Bryce said, "namely, the ivory seahorse that disappeared from the Vale Gallery following Lionel's death." Gant raised a brow. "Are you accusing me of theft?" "I'm accusing no one," Bryce said, "but the seahorse is missing, and according to Mr. Marchmont, you had a particular interest in it, as well as the parchment that was concealed within." For a fleeting moment, Gant's smile faltered. Then he gave a low chuckle. "Oliver Marchmont is a coward with a guilty conscience. I funded the gallery's restoration as a business decision. I had no idea Vale had uncovered anything so valuable." "Then you won't mind explaining," Poirot said, stepping forward. "Why the parchment, allegedly proving a dynastic link between the merchant Tobias Vale and a royal charter, was traced to a purchase made through one of your subsidiaries in Geneva?" The room stilled. Gant took a step toward Poirot. "I suggest you be very careful, monsieur. Allegations of that nature are based on documentation," Poirot interrupted, producing a folded printout from his inner coat pocket. "Your company, Armitage Holdings, acquired a box of maritime records from the curio collection in Geneva. Among them, the parchment, now missing. Edgar Conway's notes referenced it, did they not?" Gant's nostrils flared. "You have no proof." "But we do," Bryce said. "And if you have nothing to hide, you won't mind us searching your vault." The silence stretched. Then, with a thin, cold smile, Gant turned and led them to a glass panel at the far end of the corridor. He pressed his thumb to a scanner, and the door unlocked with a mechanical click. The vault room was clinical. Stainless steel shelving lined the walls, each unit neatly catalogued. Poirot moved slowly, scanning titles, crates, and carefully labelled binders. And then, on the third shelf, midway back, he stopped. There, nestled in a velvet-lined display box, was the Seahorse. Ivory white, exquisitely carved, and unmistakably real. Gant stood behind him. "It was delivered anonymously. I assumed it was a replica, a curiosity." Poirot turned, one brow lifted. "Then you will not object to our experts verifying its authenticity?" "Of course not." But Poirot's gaze did not waver. "You see, Monsieur Gant, the forgery is clever, but the original had a hairline fracture on its left fin. This one does not. It is the replica that you placed here to mislead us." Gant's lips parted, but no words came. Bryce moved in. "Where is the original?" Gant exhaled, cold and resigned. "Gone. Sold privately. I had no interest in the parchment, only in turning the artifact into liquidity. Vale wanted it preserved. Edgar wanted it exposed. Both were liabilities." There it was. The mask fell. Gant's voice was calm, too calm. "I didn't kill either of them with my own hands, but I ensured it would happen." Poirot stared at him, deeply, gravely. "You arranged for Edgar's murder. And Lionel?" "I encouraged him to disappear, paid him to leave the country. I didn't know he'd turn back." Bryce stepped forward. "You'll tell us everything. Who you hired, where the money went, how the exchange was arranged." "I'll speak with my solicitor." Poirot, now facing the display box again, murmured, "You believed yourself clever." but ambition without conscience is a weapon easily turned inward. As officers moved to arrest Gant, Poirot turned toward the window. The sky had begun to darken. Another storm was coming, but at last the truth had breached the veil. Chapter 17. Shadows at dusk. The drive. Back to Vale House was subdued, the tyres whispering against the wet road as twilight thickened. Poirot sat motionless, his hands folded atop his cane, gaze fixed on the passing hedgerows. Inspector Bryce glanced across from the wheel but said nothing. There was a quiet intensity about the detective, as though a mechanism in his mind continued to spin, yet content with the outcome. "You believe Gant is still hiding something?" Bryce said finally, unable to suppress the thought. Poirot tilted his head just slightly. "Mon ami, when a man engineers the deaths of two others to cover his greed, he rarely acts alone. I believe Gant may be at the centre, yes, but not the only player on the board." Bryce frowned. "You think Marchmont had a hand in it?" Poirot made a delicate gesture with his fingers. "Not Marchmont, perhaps. He is weak, yes, but not ruthless. And weakness of will does not equate to criminal intent. But someone else, someone close enough to Lionel Vale or Edgar Conway to know their schedules, their vulnerabilities." As they pulled into the gravel drive of Vale House, the great windows glowed amber in the deepening dusk. Poirot stepped out first, his patent leather shoes tapping against the stones. The rain had ceased, but the air was heavy, charged with something unsaid. Inside, Mrs. Northcote greeted them with the same pinched expression, her apron smudged with flour. "You've visitors?" she said curtly. "Waiting in the study?" Bryce and Poirot exchanged glances. In the study the fire crackled low. Seated in the wing-back chair nearest the hearth was Miss Beatrice Vale, her hands folded tightly in her lap, face pale beneath her ash-blonde hair. Standing beside her, almost protectively, was Dr. Simon Larch. Poirot approached gently. "Mademoiselle Vale, Dr. Larch, to what do we owe this visit?" Beatrice lifted her eyes. "I heard about Gant's arrest. I had to come." Her voice was strained. "There's something I didn't tell you before." Poirot said nothing. He merely nodded and took a seat opposite. Beatrice's fingers twisted together. "A month before Lionel died, or vanished, I suppose, I found a letter among his papers. It was unsigned, but it warned him to stop pursuing the parchment. It said, if he pushed further, the past would come back to claim him." Bryce leaned forward. "You didn't think to bring this to us earlier?" "I was frightened," she said. "It wasn't just the warning. It mentioned my father." Tobias Vale Poirot's eyes narrowed. "What precisely did it say?" Beatrice swallowed. "What your father began, you will finish. Let sleeping kings lie. The charter is death." For a moment, even Bryce was silent. Then Poirot rose slowly and crossed to the bookshelf behind him. He drew down the slim blue ledger Lionel had kept, the one Edgar had referenced in his notes. He opened it and paged through carefully until he reached the final entry. "Courier purchase logged, cross-reference GV22, parchment degraded, ink visible under compound lens, translation incomplete, Latin root presumptus, presumed." He turned back to the others. "Mademoiselle Vale, your father did more than curate art. He suppressed the truth, a truth others were willing to kill to keep buried." Beatrice looked stricken. "Then Lionel, he was trying to undo that silence." Poirot nodded. "And in doing so he made enemies of men like Gant. But there is one piece still missing." He turned to Dr. Larch, who had been silent until now. "You were Lionel's physician, were you not?" Larch nodded stiffly. "And Edgar Conway's confidant?" Larch blinked. "I treated Edgar occasionally, yes." Poirot stepped closer. Tell me, Doctor, how did you come to be the one who certified Lionel's mental health before his travel abroad? The signature on the clinic records in Geneva, they are yours. Larch's jaw tightened. You knew of Lionel's breakdown, Poirot pressed. You perhaps even facilitated his disappearance. Why? Larch didn't speak. His eyes darted to Beatrice, then to Bryce. Poirot raised a hand. I do not accuse, I only ask. What else do you know? At last, Larch spoke, voice low. He wasn't mad, he only wanted them to think he was. He wanted out, to vanish, before Gant could silence him too. I helped him, yes, I falsified the records. But I didn't know Edgar would die, or that it would all fall apart. Poirot studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. The time for half-truths is past, monsieur. If Lionel is still alive, we must find him, before Gant's allies do. Outside, a wind had risen. The branches scraped the windows like skeletal fingers. Somewhere in the dark, a truth waited, still hidden, still dangerous. And Poirot would find it. Chapter 18. The final revelation. Morning arrived crisp and grey. The mists clung low over Vale House, coiling like memory around its gables. Within the study, Hercule Poirot stood by the tall window, gazing out across the dew-laced lawn. He had not slept. The night had been spent in quiet reflection, the little grey cells turning over each contradiction, each silence, each over-explained truth. Behind him, Inspector Bryce entered, holding a telegram in his hand. It's from Interpol, Bryce said. The clinic in Geneva confirms Dr. Larch's name, appears on forged transfer documents. Lionel Vale was moved under pseudonym 3 weeks before Conway's death. Poirot turned. And where was he taken? A private estate near Lausanne, registered to a shell company, traced, eventually, to someone much closer to home. Bryce handed over the file. Poirot scanned it, his expression tightening. Ah, he said softly. Mais, naturellement. Later that afternoon, the drawing-room of Vale House was full once more. Beatrice Vale, pale but composed. Dr. Larch, standing at a wary distance. Gant, brought in under police guard. Marchmont, summoned reluctantly. And in the corner, a newcomer, tall, angular, wrapped in a travelling coat, face gaunt and ghost-like. Lionel Vale. The silence was absolute as he stepped into the light. "Alive," Beatrice whispered. "You're alive." Lionel looked at her, eyes hollowed by months of fear. "They wanted me dead or vanished. I chose the second." Poirot stepped forward, calm and composed. "And you, Monsieur Vale, entrusted your life to a man you thought an ally, a man who kept your enemies close." Lionel looked at Dr. Larch, then slowly nodded. He said it was safer. I believed him. Poirot faced the room. It was never merely about the charter. It was about the scandal it threatened to reveal, of land ownership falsified during the war, titles misappropriated, and one man who could trace them back to the source. He gestured to Marchmont. The Vale lands were seized briefly during the war under emergency acts, but someone manipulated the return documents. A signature on an outdated map reinserted Lionel's claim, one that, if validated, would have invalidated decades of development. Gant stood to lose his empire, Marchmont his inheritance, and Dr. Larch. Poirot turned. You, monsieur, facilitated the erasure of Lionel to maintain the illusion of madness. You orchestrated the threat letter. You ensured Edgar Conway died before his report could reach the public. Larch's face was ashen. "No proof," he muttered. "You have no proof." "But I do," said Poirot calmly. "Conway's final notes, restored from his dictaphone. And Lionel's own journals recovered from the Lausanne estate. They name you, detail the plan, and more than that." He turned to Gant. Your greed, monsieur, undid you. You could not resist seeking the parchment again, ordering Marchmont to break into the crypt a second time just before Lionel was to return. But Conway had already hidden it, and once it was gone, you had no leverage, so you struck again. Gant said nothing. His face was stone. Poirot stepped away from the fire, folding his hands. It is done. The parchment, though destroyed, has been transcribed. Its contents, harmless to most, but damning to the guilty, will be released to the proper authorities. He paused. Justice, he said softly, has many forms. This one was quiet, hidden in shadows, but it, too, is justice. That evening, as twilight returned to Vale House, Poirot took a final walk through the gardens. Beatrice joined him beneath the old linden tree, the air fragrant with the last breath of summer. "Will he stay?" she asked. "Lionel?" Poirot smiled gently. "Perhaps, or perhaps he will seek peace elsewhere. Some ghosts, Mademoiselle Vale, are too deeply rooted for home to feel like a sanctuary." She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, for everything." He inclined his head, hat in hand. "It is not the murderer that fascinates me," he said. "It is the silence that allows murder to grow. In this case, the silence was centuries deep, but no silence lasts forever." She watched him walk back toward the house, the wind stirring his coat, his figure trim and precise, even in retreat. Somewhere within Vale House, the past was being rewritten. And Hercule Poirot, master of order and truth, had once more restored balance from chaos,